that it's moved from things that happened in the past, so things that are considered and researched and selected. We've moved from that into things that are very much of the moment, that are of now, that are happening in real time, both here in Dublin, in Trinity College, online, and around the world. And so this morning, we get to talk about displacement. We get to talk about the creation of places to age in, to create home in. In the afternoon, we get to talk about projects that in real time are wrestling with real issues with the skills and assets that people have to hand, building from science, building from neuroscience. And in the afternoon, to bring us to a close, we talk about grief. We talk about the neuroscience of grief and real-time explorations to try and process trauma, to try and create, as Christopher Bailey from the WHO said yesterday, a healthy world. How do we make a better world? So, creativity, neuroscience, and equity, and this very session about displacement, displaced issues. So it's my enormous pleasure to be joined by Tala Al-Rosan from the University of San Diego, by Zalish Halamzi of the Refugee Trauma Initiative, and by Durkani Ayubi, who is Afghan, currently living in Adelaide. Morning all. We're going to start this with the presentation by Tala, and while we can connect all around the world, the one thing that we can't do is change the time zones, and nor should we. So Tala did us the great pleasure of pre-recording a piece that she's going to present. Then we'll talk about Zalish's work, which is happening in real time, and we've been working hard all morning, which was why we're a little late starting, to make it as contemporary and current as we possibly can. And the Durkani is going to help us think about this in a whole different way, and then we have, I hope, we make it as up-to-date as we can possibly do. So, good morning, everybody. It's very nice to see you. I'm just going to cut straight to the first video by Tala, and we'll get started. We've been saying all week that in between the automation, the digital future that we're sold, is usually a woman called Eileen or a man called Brian.
Hello, salam, which means peace be upon you. I hope you're doing great and enjoying this amazing event. I wish I was able to join you in person. Unfortunately, due to the time differences, I have to record this. My name is Dr. Tala Al-Rosan. I am an assistant professor at the University of California in San Diego, and I'm originally from Jordan. I'll be talking to you today about displacement and health. I truly believe that worldwide mobility is our future, regardless of laws and rules. I'd like to remind us all that migration is a normal human behavior. That is how civilizations are created. That is like the pollination of plants that ends up creating better products and better human story. However, forced migration is not normal, and the lack of response to the needs of migrants are not normal, and the current global anti-refugee rhetoric, which cannot be denied, is not normal. Also, I like to remind us all that language matters in this area. A migrant is a generic term that can be given to anybody who moves from their country, whether it's for education or like in my case, I moved from Jordan to the United States for education, and then I got offered a great job here, and I stayed. However, an asylum seeker is a person who have formally submitted a request for asylum but have not yet completed the asylum procedure. So those are people that want to leave their country because of reasons that they want the UNHCR, which is the United Nations High Commission of Refugees, to look at. A refugee, on the other hand, is a person who has completed the asylum process, meaning that their cases have been very thoroughly vetted and looked at, and they have been given a positive outcome, being granted this protection, this human rights protection and for better lives in different countries. So seeking asylum is a normal human right. In fact, now, unfortunately, we are living through very difficult times, the highest number of refugees since World War II. In fact, we believe these are the highest numbers of refugees we have ever witnessed. And there are currently 1 billion migrants. Of those, about 85 million who are forcibly displaced. Of those, 27 millions are refugees. Almost 5 million are asylum seekers, and 4.3 people are stateless. Just to give you an idea, also put things in perspectives, there are almost 45,000 people every day that are forced to flee their homes. That's 20 people every minute, and 1 person every 2 seconds have to leave their homes. Yet we rarely talk about these populations and this issue. Here to the far right down here, we see the demographics of people who have been forcibly displaced. Unfortunately, although children account for 30% of the world's population, they are highly represented in the forcibly displaced populations, and they make up about 42% of all forcibly displaced. So men and women flee their homes. There is a higher representation of people who are between the ages of 18 to 59. Those are the ones that can make the journeys, usually daunting journeys, very difficult journeys. I want you all to imagine the journeys that these people go through, whether it's the emotional stress of having their UNHCR claim being looked at, whether it is the actual physical journey, whether it is the fear of unknown. We also know that about 85% of all those refugees are hosted by countries that are struggling, by the global south, countries with limited resource like my home country of Jordan. So as of 2021, about 2/3 of the world's refugees came from 5 countries. Of course, the majority came from Syria. About 7 million refugees came from Syria, 4 million from Venezuela, about 3 million from Afghanistan, and then South Sudan, Myanmar also. Unfortunately, now with the crisis unfolding in Ukraine, there are currently 3 million Ukrainians that will join this group, and these figures, unfortunately. Also, it's very important to remember that for these people, usually the return to normality is very, very difficult, meaning that actually the average stay of a refugee in refugee camps that are abundant in the global south. In fact, Jordan, my home country, is home to the largest refugee camp for Syrians worldwide. The average stay of refugees there is 15 to 20 years. 15 to 20 years. So those are entire generations that spend the majority of their lives in refugee camps, in these open air prisons, in these confined settings that are man-made because of our failure as human beings to respond to the needs of fellow human beings. And luckily, towards the end of this session, you will hear from my very dear friend Rima, who has lived the majority of her life in Zaatari camp and now is a student at a university in Canada. I can't wait for you to hear from Rima. Just to take you back to the history of the refugee policy. So in fact, us as human beings have been thinking about how to help people in danger return to their homeland since 1921. However, the United Nations post-World War II established an entity within it called the UNHCR, or the United Nations Higher Commissioner of Refugees. That's a UN entity that's completely focused on the needs of the forcibly displaced. That is also when the Convention on Refugees defined refugees, and this definition is the following. A refugee is a person who has left country of origin because of well-founded fear of persecution due to race, religion, nationality, political opinion, membership of a social group. We also know that there are stateless populations, people of no nationality. There are persons of concern, such as Kurds in Iraq and civilians in Bosnia. And there's the term IDPs that we use a lot, which is internally displaced populations. Also, we know that now we're seeing the term economic migrants, being more prevalent, and it's really becoming increasingly difficult to make the distinction between an economic migrant versus a refugee. There are many push and pull factors, such as in the case of Venezuela. There is evidence of persecution that may not be available, really. A whole country like Venezuela has been suffering from inflation, but the evidence of persecution cannot usually be well characterized in the case of many people. Also, industrialized states may not recognize generalized violence in Latin America, the breakdown of civil orders, internal conflicts. Those are all making it difficult to grant a refugee status or asylum. That's why a lot of the asylees are stuck here 1 hour away from me on the Tijuana, Mexico-US border here in San Diego. Also, now we're living through a pandemic, and we're being introduced more and more to core public health concepts. This is us as public health practitioners, how we like to think of health. This is what you see in front of you here, the socioecological model of health, which is that health is not influenced just by age and individual factors and sex and hereditary factors and your genes and all of this, but rather, individual lifestyle factors, social and community influences, where you live, where you work, where you worship, where you socialize, and more generally, the general socioeconomic, cultural, environmental conditions, those all impact health. And we know that migration cuts across all of those. That's why migration is called a social determinant of health. And that's why it influences all these aspects. And there's a life course approach to thinking about migration, because especially since you guys in Ireland are very familiar with conflict and famine and difficult conditions that make people migrate and move, and those all impact a population's health in general. For example, policy and strategy, the availability of data and policy change, language and cultural barriers, patient-physician interactions, those cultural barriers really play a major role in how refugees seek care too. So we see a lot of refugees not seeking healthcare post-resettlement because of these barriers. We know also the gender norms really differ a lot. The culture differs, living and working conditions, how many of those refugees can find jobs and are given the opportunity to find jobs and access education equitably. I teach a course on migration and health to my students in San Diego who come from all over the world, and I ask them when they think of displacement, what are the words that come to their mind? And here to the top right, you see the words that come to someone's brain when we think about displacement: refugees, trauma, family, detention, stress, camp, settlement, strategies, anger, Syria, Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, women, mental health, gender. All of those are really very intertwined. Those are all issues that overlap in many of the times. So being a refugee also sometimes, unfortunately, is associated with mental health issues. It's associated with gender-based violence. That's what happens when people lose their jobs, and you confine them to refugee camps and to settings where you do not provide any strategies or intervention for integration in society. This is also to the left an image that is showing the myriad of health challenges that arise with the journey that these populations and millions of people across the world make every day. For example, we've crossed both sea and land with our young children. We've had long stretches without clean water, proper food. It's starting to get very cold. Our plan is to reach a safe shelter to rest. My pregnant wife was not able to receive prenatal care during the journey. I have heart disease. I'm older, and I don't have access to my medications. I'm physically exhausted. I want you all to imagine yourself being in the shoes of these people, because nobody is immune to becoming a refugee, and now it's hitting hard in the heart of Europe and Ukraine. So please, I want you all to really imagine what it's like for these millions of people. Most of us are stressed and anxious about our future. We're often shunned because people think we carry infectious diseases. My son is dehydrated. He had food poisoning. He's weak. Will I be able to explain this condition to a doctor? We also know that nearly 1 in 10 that are refugees and resettled has, unfortunately, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and mental health issues such as depression and anxiety. Also, us as epidemiologists and people who study populations all at once like to think of health, not just by one snapshot of a time looking at a population, but thinking what happened at the place of origin for these people, what happened during travel and transit, what about place of destination, so whether they end up in San Diego or in Dublin. What are the current policies, the legal status, language issues, duration of stay? Are we adjusting services so that they're culturally sensitive to these people? Are we welcoming them the way we should? And of course, the return in case they wanted to return. And I can assure you there's almost not a single refugee that I worked with, whether I saw in my clinic or I interviewed for my research purposes, there's not a single refugee who didn't want to go back home. They all long for memories back home. They all want to go back home. Unfortunately, there's no home left. So what is displacement? Displacement is a term I like to use because unfortunately, when I say refugee health, a lot of people, I lose a lot of my audience because of the crazy political climate we're living in many countries. So I like to use the term displacement because I truly believe that it also does apply to many populations all over the world. Displacement is the act of forcibly displacing people so that they lose their home and they have to adapt to new environments. So that also, for example, applies to the homeless population. Those are people that end up living on the streets and lose their homes. Incarcerated populations, people who lose everything that they call home and end up in jails and prisons. Eviction, a lot of people are losing the ability, especially during the pandemic now, to afford housing, and they're ending up having to leave their homes. Pandemics are causing this mass movement of people across the world. Climate change and climate refugees here in California. I almost, every season, wildfire season, we get ready for families that lose their homes to the bone. It's burnt to the bone, and they have to start from scratch, and all the chronic stress and memory issues that arise with that. We also are focusing on war refugees, and you'll be hearing more about this. So, refugees usually suffer from chronic stress, and probably in other sessions you've heard how chronic stress impacts health through different physiologic responses to stress, whether it's acute versus chronic. However, chronic stress, we know very well, is associated with increased insulin resistance, increased oxidative stress, and impaired memory function. However, in the literature, the association between displacement and memory is not well characterized. And that's what my research group at the University of California focuses on. We have a research program that is completely focused on displacement and the brain health outcomes. Unfortunately, the current research on refugee health is not perfect, and that's why we need a lot of researchers, a lot of people from different disciplines to start really thinking about this issue more and more, and how can they build the evidence that can be readily used by different agencies of change. For example, mental health research is dominating the field. We need more research on cardiovascular disease, infectious diseases, on brain health. We also, unfortunately, almost always study refugees all at once. So cross-sectionally, we take a snapshot at a time, and we don't follow up with these refugees over time. And that's what our research program is trying to focus on the most. So we're really looking at creating connections between different spaces. So for example, refugees that end up here in San Diego, a huge refugee resettlement hub. In fact, it is the second largest refugee resettlement city in the United States. Many of the same Syrian and Iraqi refugees and Somali refugees that end up in San Diego live 2 to 3 to 4 years sometimes in Jordan. So we're trying to create connections between both countries to understand this long long-term impact of displacement on their health. So we have multiple research projects going on. One of them that we're very excited about is on mental health performance, on cognitive health in refugees who live in Zaatari camp. Again, the largest refugee camp for Syrians worldwide and one of the largest refugee camps ever. We also study refugees in San Diego and try to understand dementia risk factors, and we focus on hypertension in particular because uncontrolled blood pressure is a big problem in this population. And as you know, high blood pressure is very closely tied with chronic stress. These are just images of Damascus. Damascus was a beautiful city. This is the capital of Syria and what is believed to be the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world, dating back to at least 11,000 years. Unfortunately, the war in Syria that started 11 years ago has left Damascus looking like this. We lost a lot of the human capital, but also the heritage and the historical sites in Damascus. That's why the UN has called the Syrian crisis the biggest humanitarian refugee crisis of our time. And now fast forward 11 years later, people are still from Syria moving and trying to look for resettlement in other places and making very difficult journeys. And now we're seeing the Ukrainian crisis also the same, similar images here at the heart of Europe. So really the refugee crisis is not just, is no longer something that happens in the global south or in Africa or in the Middle East. It can happen to anyone. So Jordan is a huge refugee resettlement hub in the world. Almost 1 in 3 people in Jordan is a refugee. These are some images of our work in Jordan and some of the collaborating, the agencies we work with, the donors, the group of Atlantic Fellows you see here, multiple refugees to the far right here, and Rima is one of them here. Rima is in the middle here. You will hear from her towards the end of the session. Finally, I'd like to leave you all with a note of hope. We know that refugees make countries more prosperous. We know that migrants contribute to the economy of different countries. We know that migrants are and asylum seekers and refugees actually are stories of innovations and creativity and entrepreneurship. And this has been documented by various researchers all over the world that looked at big data. So the data really is in favor of this. Finally, because of the session that really focuses on equity, I'd like to remind us all what's the difference between equality versus equity. Equality means sameness, and we don't want sameness. The world is becoming more colorful. The world is becoming more heterogeneous and diverse and globalized. We want equity, which is fairness, access to the same opportunities, not giving everyone the same thing, but rather treating people with dignity and fairness. Finally, I hope you enjoyed this. This is just as a quick introduction to the associations between displacement and health. I am so happy to connect with you. Please feel free to reach out. This is my email address here and my Twitter, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you so much.
So we asked Tala, would she do an overview? Would she give us the broad picture? All week we've been talking about creative brains solve problems. They solve problems in real time. And the questions that they ask are based on lived experience often. I'd like to welcome everybody that's joined us in this space, which is a brave space, which is a safe space. I'd also like to welcome Zalesht Halamzi. So when we started to talk about who do we know that's working through these problems in a creative way in real time, Zalesht was the first person that came to mind. So Zalesht is the founding director of the Refugee Trauma Initiative, mainly based at the moment between London, UK, and also between Greece, but I think that's changing and evolving. So Zalesht, from Dublin to wherever you may be in the digital world, I'd like to hand over to you.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Dom and Creative Brain Week for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm speaking to you from a very rainy London today. 6 years ago, I set up Refugee Trauma Initiative with one intention, to alleviate the psychological suffering that I saw on the Syrian-Turkish border in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. Refugee Trauma Initiative, RTI, supports people heal from toxic stress and trauma that comes from violence and forced displacement. We started in Greece in 2016, and now in addition to Greece, we're working in Albania, Kosovo, and Italy, and about to start supporting refugees from Ukraine and Poland, Moldova, and Romania. I set up RTI because when I witnessed the suffering of Syrians who were fleeing their country to Turkey, I knew just how acute and how deep that suffering was. I'd experienced it myself as a child living in Afghanistan, and then as a displaced teenager in London, as my family tried to make a new life for ourselves. The people we serve, like me, have seen the worst side of humanity. They've come face to face with that capacity for destruction, for cruelty, for dehumanizing and devaluating other beings to the point where their lives don't matter. They've seen bombs fall on their homes, they've seen death, and they've left everything they know behind. When my family was going through this, we felt so many new things. There were tangible losses we could account for, things we could see and touch, like our home, friends, and members of our family. Our favorite things, like a leather satchel my grandmother had made for me on my first day of school. But we lost our bearings too, our place in society, our language, our sense of how things worked in the world, and what we believed about the world. When I first started working in camps in northern Greece, the people who came to our little tent had the same look of bewilderment and confusion that I'd felt all those years ago. In the middle of a camp on the Greek-Macedonian border where 13,000 people had been halted by the EU-Turkey deal, we set up a space that offered respite from the chaos of the camp. People came in to talk, to draw, to paint, and to feel part of a community again. Despite how crowded the camp was, people felt dislocated and alone. Women and children that came in complained about pain in their bodies. Children as young as 3 or 4 talked about hurt in their bellies, and not because they were hungry. It felt as though nothing could alleviate this pain. People were having nightmares and experiencing overwhelming emotions, grief and sadness and anger over what had happened to them. People felt completely unsafe. When feeling safe is splintered and people feel unsafe and unseen, RTI works to help bring the internal safe system back online. We create spaces where people can convene and heal as a community. In our spaces, suffering is held, expressed, and acknowledged. Our facilitators are trained to help people stay in their body, to take care of themselves as they go through a crisis, and to restore connection to others. And that's where we get creative. When grief and loss have no expression other than stomping your feet and shaking your body, this is what we do. In our body and mind groups, women work with dance therapists to express themselves through dance and music. And our group for young children, we play to heal. Children paint, get messy, take on different roles, and dance to make sense of the dislocating feelings of violence and of displacement. Young people in our youth group make things as a way to gain confidence and to find their feet in an uncertain environment. We've made jewelry, written and performed plays. We've made films and put on photography exhibitions. If you come into an RTI space, you will see children playing and drawing, a mother singing a lullaby in her own language, a facilitated teaching and grounding exercise to help people feel a sense of calm and a sense of joy. And everything that we do is underpinned by values. We practice understanding, curiosity, and respect to everyone that comes through the door. In these spaces, we recognize and acknowledge trauma without pathologizing the very normal human reaction that people have to the reckless violence they've experienced. And we bear witness and recognize that these experiences are the result of systemic injustice and oppression that often have colonial roots, which has dehumanized and killed people for centuries. Community is at the heart of this work. We work based on a simple yet fundamental notion that feelings of safety are inextricably tied to feeling connected to a community where you feel worthy and you feel seen. A community that will recognize and care for how you're feeling, where you can experience joy and belonging. This is all so that we can dislodge distressing and traumatic experiences before they can change your brain architecture and trap people in a never-ending cycle of depression and anxiety. It's to prevent the long-term health, economic, and relational impact of this kind of distress on people. Our practice helps people create new neural pathways, learn new skills and new ways of understanding and integrating their experiences. For me, what's so important about this work is to make healing, play, and creativity accessible to everyone. To demonstrate that if you have had the terrible luck of finding yourself displaced from your home, your needs do not stop at food and shelter. Everyone needs to feel safe, and that feeling safe is a fundamental human right. What shows up for people in our groups is transformation, the growth and resilience that can come from experiencing trauma. When we're held in care in moments of suffering, we can expand our sense of self, the boundaries of our understanding, and our capacity for empathy. We can experience the creativity that's born out of survival. When I sit in some of these groups, I'm aware of my own ongoing healing journey and what it took to integrate myself after all that I saw. The necessity of expressing what had happened to me. The years it took to connect with and love my body, not just fear it. The community that helps me and brings me back to light when I feel down, and how this is the work of a lifetime. Yet we continue to make wars instead of peace. In the past few weeks, 3 million people from Ukraine have joined the 84 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. And more than half of this figure are women and children. What startles me even more is the number of people living in active conflict zones. According to Save the Children, 420 million children are living in places where violence is the norm. These are staggering numbers, but behind each one is a person, a human being with hopes and dreams, likes and dislikes, an enormous potential. Human beings that are struggling to make sense of the violence they're seeing and wondering how to live in a world that disregards their lives. I'm preparing to go to the Ukrainian border to set up spaces for crisis management, to help people feel grounded and tethered just as their world is unraveling around them. To bear witness and to acknowledge the suffering of the people caught in the war in Ukraine. And as I do this, I invite you all to reflect on all the violence perpetuated around the world, on the wars that have been waged in our name, on supremacy and how it continues to wreak havoc, and how you can make a difference in making and building peace in your own community. I want to end with a poem that's a beautiful invitation for all of us to heal ourselves and this world, to make a better world. It's by Joy Harjo. It's called For Calling the Spirit Back from Wandering the Earth and Its Human Feet. Put down that bag of potato chips, that white bread, that bottle of pop. Turn off that cell phone, computer, and remote control. Open the door, then close it behind you. Take a breath offered by friendly winds. They travel the earth, gathering essences of plants to clean. Give it back with gratitude. If you sing, it will give your spirit lift to fly to the stars' ears and back. Acknowledge this earth who has cared for you since you were a dream, planting itself precisely within your parents' desire. Let your moccasin feet take you to the encampment of the guardians who have known you before time, who will be there after time. They sit before the fire that has been there without time. Let the earth stabilize your post-colonial insecure jitters. Be respectful of the small insects, birds, and animal people who accompany you. Ask their forgiveness for the harm we humans have brought down upon them. Don't worry. The heart knows the way through. There may be high rises, interstates, checkpoints, armed soldiers, massacres, wars, and those who will despise you because they despise themselves. The journey might take you a few hours, a day, a year, a few years, 100, 1,000, or even more. Watch your mind. Without training, it might run away and leave your heart for the immense human feast set by the thieves of time. Do not hold regrets. When you find your way to the circle, to the fire kept burning by the keepers of your soul, you will be welcomed. You must clean yourself with cedar, sage, or other healing plants. Cut the ties you have to failure and shame. Let go the pain you're holding in your mind, your shoulders, your heart, and all the way to your feet. Let go the pain of your ancestors to make way for those who are heading in our direction. Ask for forgiveness. Call upon the help of those who love you. These helpers take many forms: animal, element, bird, angel, saint, stone, or ancestor. Call your spirit back. It may be caught in corners and creases of shame, judgment, and human abuse. You must call it in a way that your spirit will want to return. Speak to it as if you would to a beloved child. Welcome your spirit back from its wandering. It may return in pieces and tatters. Gather them together. They will be happy to be found after being lost for so long. Your spirit will need to sleep a while after it's bathed and given clean clothes. Now you can have a party. Invite everyone you know who loves and supports you. Keep room for those who have no place else to go. Make a giveaway, and remember, keep the speeches short. Then you must do this. Help the next person find their way through the dark. Thank you.
So Ailesh, thank you. Creative brains solve problems. They solve problems in real time. We are working in real time. This is not television. This is real life. This is a digital room and a real room. Thank you for bringing Joy Harjo in, and the heart will find the way into the conversation. Thank you for bringing the role of poets to help us make sense when the narrative is fractured and help us figure out how we navigate. It's a theme we'll pick up again this afternoon when we talk about grief, when we talk about the neuroscience of grief and the art of response to grief. This session is going to run slightly longer than intended. Be kind to yourselves. If you need to leave, leave, but we'd love you to stay. This is a practice that's happening in real time. So Zalish, I know when you say that you are preparing to head off to Ukraine, that's a real thing. If you can stay with us for the next presentation, where I've asked Rachel Hoare from the research into children, she'll explain probably in a minute, to join me on the stage to talk about what's happening in Trinity and in her own work. And Dukani, I know it's increasingly late in Adelaide, but I hope you might stay with us as well. If you can do, but if you can't, be kind to yourself. So what I'd like to do now is turn to Rachel and to ask about, at this moment in this place, what is happening in Trinity, but also more widely, what's happening with the work that you do. And I'll give you the stage for a couple of minutes.
Thank you, Dominic. Thanks, everybody. So my name's Rachel Hoare. I'm actually a lecturer in the School of Languages, Literatures and Cultures here in Trinity, but I'm also an expressive arts psychotherapist, and I'm currently working with unaccompanied minors on behalf of TUSLA. So I just wanted to talk a few minutes to you about my psychotherapy work, because it very much integrates knowledge about the brain and the ways in which trauma impacts the brain with creative approaches. So I was delighted to see Zala's approach. It's very, very difficult to follow her. I will also, as Dominic said, just say a few words about initiatives that are happening with the different ways in which staff and students in Trinity are also providing practical support to those seeking asylum. As you're probably aware, psychotherapy has traditionally been called the talking cure. But many of those who have experienced forced displacement have had traumatic experiences, and research shows that language is generally not accessible to trauma survivors after a distressing event. In particular, Broca's area, which is a section of the brain that controls language, is basically shut down when people experience trauma. And that makes it really difficult to relate the trauma narrative, and that leads to difficulties in identifying and verbalizing experiences. And perhaps this inability to verbalize these experiences and these responses to trauma really relates to the human survival response. When an experience is extremely painful to recall, the brain protects the individual by literally making it impossible to talk about it. As trauma is stored as somatic sensations and images, it might not be readily available communication through language, but may be available, as Alice has already talked about, through sensory means such as creative arts, play, dance, music, and other experiential activities and approaches. So I just want to illustrate this with literally one image, which I think really powerfully illustrates how one young person used art to express his experiences of forced migration. And I've obtained permission to share this with you, and it's the third slide there, so hopefully. Can everybody see it? Not yet. Okay, it's here on my screen. Sorry. Never fails. I'm just worried I'll shut the whole thing down or something. Is it because I've got that? Okay. Apologies, my fault. Okay, good. Hopefully that's clear. So I've just called this the Discourses of the Unsayable, and in order to protect the identity of the young person, I don't know if you're familiar with all the flags on this piece of work, but I'm not going to mention the countries until I get into Europe. So this was a young person's documentation of his voyage. And if you see that the flags are on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, you've got images. So for example, you'll see an image of a cross, you'll see an image of the desert and little footprints in the bottom left-hand corner of the left-hand image. You've got somebody sitting, looking extremely I suppose, extremely upset. And you've got also an image of a hand. And one of the young man's friends who I was working with had experienced torture and had some of his fingers, parts of his fingers removed. You can see that in the picture there. So very, very harrowing images here, which illustrate this young man's journey, which he was completely unable to talk about, but he was able to illustrate it in this way. So on the right-hand side there of the screen, you've got his journey in Europe, and it gets progressively easier. You see there against the French flag, the picture there is a little picture of the young man is holding up a little cup that he won in the Calais jungle at the time for boxing, because he'd won a boxing competition there. And then you see at the bottom there the image of the Irish flag and a dove, actually, to illustrate, to denote peace. So I really wanted to just share that with you, because I thought it really showed very clearly how there's no way this young person could have spoken about these things, but the very process of going through it artistically. I mean, if you see the little sand image there, we made that in the therapy room. I have a sand tray in the therapy room, and we made that and photographed it. There were no words. It was all done in the art, and I think this is just an amazing portrayal of his journey and of the healing that did happen. So I just want to move on now and say a few words about the different ways in which Trinity. So that's my own work. I'm bringing my own work into different courses and different conversations and different aspects of the work we're doing in Trinity. But Trinity College is engaging with those seeking asylum. Firstly, just to mention, a group of Trinity students and alumni has recently founded Action for Ukraine to create awareness and raise funds for the war there. Trinity was awarded its University of Sanctuary status in February of 2021 in recognition of its efforts supporting young asylum seekers and in order to be able to help them to access undergraduate education in the college. They're offering 4 Asylum Seeker Access Provision scholarships every year to students in reception centres. They have a long way to go. I'm part of the committee that are trying to increase the number of scholarships. We're very conscious that, we're not doing enough. It's also a member of the Scholars at Risk Network, working to defend the human rights of scholars around the world. It advocates on behalf of academics who've been persecuted. And it's also provides human rights advocacy as well for those scholars. It offers an elective module, of which I'm coordinator, which is open to students from virtually all disciplines in college on the human experience of forced displacement. And as part of that elective, we have panel discussions where we have people from many different places with many different experiences coming and speaking to the students, and we find that has huge impact on the students and on their career pathways. And finally, we're in the process of setting up a research centre in forced migration studies, which, as well as bringing academics together from different disciplines in order to apply for big research grants, will eventually offer continuous professional development modules and master courses. Thank you very much, and thanks for giving me the opportunity, Dominic.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much. Thank you. So we join a story in motion. We've talked about all week. We join something that's already happening. We're sitting here in a room with the sound of trains moving past us. It can be very difficult to pull out far enough to get a sense of the bigger picture in the story that we've joined. We're only here to go. Dukani Ayubi, would you be able to join us from Adelaide? We rely on the technology. Hello.
Hello.
I'm just going to hand over to you.
Sure. Thanks so much, Dominic. Good morning, everyone. It really is wonderful to be here and to be sharing with you at Creative Brain Week. Thank you to GDHI, to Trinity College Dublin, and specifically to Dominic for inviting me to be part of a wonderful panel with Zarlash and Tala, 2 women who I admire so deeply alongside. I'm joining you from the other half of the world, Adelaide, Australia, where it is a rainy but hot evening. And I'm on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to begin by saying Khosh Amadin, And I think I need to just share my screen with you. Can everyone see that okay?
We'll arrive in a
All right,
second.
great. Is that all right, Dominic?
2 seconds.
Okay,
There's,
sure.
we talked all week about FOMOtion, the idea that at some point there is always a human being connecting plugs, and the plugs don't fit and you need a spare one. It's the reality. You arrive in the railway station and your phone can't charge. Luckily, plugs don't do therapy. It is a long way to Adelaide. It's also a long time. There you go. We can see now.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So I want to also begin by saying Khosh Ramadan, which is written down there in diary handwriting. And what it means is that we arrive, or you arrive in this space with joy. And I hope that's an expression of how we do fill this space together, even as we discuss some challenging things. So to contextualize what I want to share with you today, I hope it to be conversational rather than overly technical or formal. And it springs from my own personal experience, my reflections, my writing, my research, my work with my family in our Afghan restaurants where I'm steeped in Afghan cuisine, from my community interactions as an Afghan-born refugee to Australia. I was born in Afghanistan in 1985 at the height of the Cold War, and that black and white photo is a picture of me, the baby, staring up with some of my family in Afghanistan. At the same year of my birth, my family became refugees and we crossed the border into Pakistan before eventually migrating to Australia. And that's a photo of my family when we first arrived in Melbourne, Australia. So now, as someone who's seen wave after wave of trauma, exile and displacement in Afghanistan, experiencing it firsthand, but also as diaspora through the 90s with the takeover of the Taliban, then subsequent US occupation with the war on terror, and through this latest devastating collapse of Afghanistan and its return to the Taliban, I am someone that is intimately aware of and interested in the inequities and inhumanity that's ingrained into the norms and narratives that underpin why displacement occurs to begin with, and how it unfolds so often in such scarring and further debilitating ways. And while there's so much to talk about in relation to displacement, what I have structured my talk with you in the time I have today focuses on three things. Firstly, conscientizing the impact of narratives in defining our realities and kind of exploring just how problematic these narratives have been. Second, exploring the reframing that can take place to challenge these inequitable norms. And third, touching upon the power of creativity in relation to displacement. Sorry, just press the next button. So, given the trajectory of displacement in my life from an early age, a recurring and resonant theme for me has been a consciousness of a disparity, a split, an ever-widening gulf that exists between my own understanding of the layered and human experience of my Afghan identity, the challenges, yes, but also the beauty, the generosity, the complexity of that identity, compared to the dehumanizing, erasing, sanitizing, and pathologizing concepts of me and of Afghanistan that were increasingly being normalized in the world. I became aware of the idea that this schism has been facilitated by the elevation of narratives in which a highly monolithic worldview prevails, where the knowledge and power of some has been valued and reinforced, while simultaneously the experiences of many who have been cast a subaltern has been diminished and erased. An awareness of this this importance of narrative for me stems from my lived reality, experiencing their critical role in shaping what's possible. They inform the legal, political, and sociocultural norms that in turn define our realities, the dignity that we're afforded, and the limit or the expanse of our collective imagination. And while there are many drivers of displacement that we can all point to, all which are now intersecting and fueling one another, things like conflict, resource scarcity, economic centralization, and climate disasters, what I would say underpins it all, what defines whether the way we treat displacement and displaced people with a sense of inhumanity or with a sense of justice, in a very large way depends on the narratives that surround it. And what has been normalized in our world are narratives that have rendered displacement problematic in several dehumanizing ways, in ways which we would all recognize as overt. For example, when demagogic leaders demonize and scapegoat the world's displaced populations as a means to achieve their own political or economic ends, but also in more subtle but equally problematic ways, the ways I'm perhaps most interested in exploring, ways that keep our understanding of displacement in a space that treats it as peripheral, as an aberration, pathologizing the displaced, an understanding which taints and renders impotent even our solutions to displacement. And also in recent weeks, with the situation unfolding in Ukraine, it has been the narratives that are a normalized part of displacement have revealed to us that there are disparities even within the way people who are displaced are treated. Some people who are displaced are treated punitively and excluded and denied their dignity, while others are welcomed. And I'm so glad that people are welcomed as refugees. And this is what needs to happen. It needs to happen more widely and more broadly, not just for a handful of people, but in ways that don't entrench racial categorizations further. So in light of this, I'm interested in how narratives operate in at least two ways. In a reactive sense, in terms of decoding how they might be limiting our understanding of displacement and further entrenching inequities, while also in a proactive sense, in terms of how they might be shifted or reframed to create more humanized realities for all of us. So in the process of decoding the present problematic narratives around displacement, it's critical to see that these norms have a long historical genesis, a genesis that is so often divorced from many of our present conversations around displacement. And it's a narrative that can be traced back to Enlightenment era philosophies that normalized and entrenched in very powerful ways a concept of stillness in nature and amongst people, as well as racialized hierarchies of worth. And as just one example of many, the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus, who wrote System Natura, created a taxonomy in 1759. It categorized humans and nature according to arbitrary Eurocentric notions of worth. His research was entirely dependent on dead subjects, secondhand information of natives from distant lands, and still notions of nature. Contributing to the science of the time, this normalized the idea that we are disparate, unmoving groups of people, masters of, sitting above and separate from nature, and further within the categories of human species, placed huge and undue emphasis on categorizations according to externalities like race and color. So this ideological and intellectual normalization of the worthlessness of some was a necessary justification for many imperial exploits, including slavery, resource redirection, and unsustainable extraction of the earth's resources, colonization and the dispossession of indigenous lands. And rather than ending with the formal end of colonization after World War II, it has remained unreckoned with and compounded. And it is continuing to play out globally in ways such as extreme, brutal policing against minority groups. And for countries like my place of birth, Afghanistan, it's playing out as an enduring militarization and an exile and waves of exile of its people from land. And it's becoming entrenched globally in increasingly powerful ways through technology. And what I've come to understand and live is that narratives of displacement are inseparable from this lens. Displacement has been defined through the same imperial prism of cultural and racial superiority and plays out in terms of who is impacted and displaced to begin with. And it's no coincidence that most of the world's displaced are from formerly colonized and presently militarized parts of the world. And also it shapes how the experience of displacement is felt. So recognizing that displacement exists in our world through this lens allows us to make sense of several things. It reveals the ways in which the narratives surrounding displacement are seen and defined predominantly through a Western lens, where movement of those cast as racially inferior has been normalized as an aberration and is always shrouded in the language of crisis. And crisis, mind you, for the Eurocentric nations that might have to receive refugees, instead of for the displaced people themselves whose lives have been uprooted. It also reveals the extent to which even our solutions to displacement become increasingly problematic when they are, as they so often are, divorced from these historical realities and focus instead only on an ethical or moral lens alone. While a moral lens is of course welcome, it can entrench further cycles of disenfranchisement when it's divorced from the historical and political realities that have brought displacement into being, elevating a notion of justice that depends not on reckoning with the polarization that has been normalized in our histories, but upon the magnanimity of host countries and in ways that absolves them of their need for accountability. And to this point, I've been working with a group of Afghan female MPs who, after the collapse of Afghanistan in August last year, were eventually evacuated to Athens, where they're all now living as displaced people and are continuing to try to do what they can despite their trauma, their grief, and despite the real and present danger they find themselves and their families in, to be of service to all those left behind in Afghanistan. They released a statement to the European Union in solidarity with the Ukrainian refugees, whose experiences so many Afghan people and so many displaced people generally identify with and share so deeply. And at the same time, they shared with me how terrified they are of having another layer of being forgotten by the world added to their and Afghanistan's experience. It seems that the narratives that shape displacement in our world have normalized the suffering of Black and brown bodies, while seeing the suffering of fair-skinned people as an outlier. It has been striking to hear reporters and global media make direct reference to how startled they are by seeing Ukrainian refugees. They outright say things like, "This isn't Afghanistan, this isn't Iraq. Our suffering and our catastrophes have been normalized in the narratives that shape the world." So this brings me to reframing. With an understanding of how the narratives of displacement marginalize so many, we can then begin the necessary work of disaggregating our response and reframing and redefining what is possible. And in doing so, we can recognize and shift several things. We can acknowledge the root causes of displacement in line with long historical and political realities that have brought it into being, that are closely associated with asymmetries in global power. And this allows us to claim that displacement does not occur in a vacuum, but is a result of global decision-making, consumption patterns, and cultural norms, making it far from peripheral, but something which we are all a part of. Understanding that helps us to interrogate the validity of the language around displacement and challenge a Western-driven narrative of crisis, and instead understand human movement as a response to crisis that has been constructed and manufactured and allowed to continue through dominant narratives that have normalized that crisis. And further, we can broaden how we understand displacement. It needn't be defined as physical alone. We can see that it takes place in many ways, through feelings of isolation in a COVID world, through losing places and parts of the planet that we love because of climate disasters. There is a spectrum of experiences of displacement, and it's becoming increasingly normalized and part of our world experience. Recognizing displacement as a shared experience in some way can help to shift the humanity that we approach it with. And we can recognize that taxonomies of stillness, like Linnaeus's, continue to eclipse and mute our psyche, overriding the reality that we now know, that everything moves. We need to claim this fluidity. Planets, billions of years ago, were in different orbits. Ancient deep coral reefs are now tectonically shifted into mountaintops, and entire forests migrate. Nature moves and we are nature. And for millions of years, human movement has ebbed and flowed back and forth, nearly always driven by changes in climate and paired with a sense of opportunity, a solution in response to difficult circumstances. Claiming this as a key part of our nature overrides the stilted fabrications that have been normalized for centuries, and instead elevates our histories of movement and exchange that define the human story. And based on my own experience, steeped in and reclaiming my own Afghan identity, I have come to understand that we all need to pay attention to and unearth in our own fields the long histories of categorization that limit the boundlessness at the heart of who we are. Through being steeped in Afghan cuisine, writing a book on it and the history that has shaped it, I have seen that far from the peripherality and isolation, far from the tribal stillness that we have been ossified into by dominant narratives, at the heart of Central Asia, as a great center of exchange and cultural fusion for millennia, there is in fact a great cross-pollination, an ancient interconnection and interdependency across boundaries that defines not just Afghanistan, but the entire living universe. And finally, this brings me to the pivotal undercurrent of creativity in relation to displacement. Creativity, both in terms of how we can use it to redefine our response to displacement, and also in claiming the way in which creativity defines the lives of displaced people and is key to our healing. Our responses should be multidisciplinary across sciences, health, education, the arts. And I say this recognizing that it is the segregating power of narratives that has cleaved us into constructed disciplinary borders to begin with, that there are, and normalized the idea that there are hard and rational sciences, and it made this the most valued form of knowledge, itself illusory. Our sciences have always been constrained by the unknown unknowns, always tempered by human judgment, like Linnaeus's racial hierarchies. And to say instead that in its purest form, it is creativity that spurs our endeavors in every field and in every form of inquiry. And further, creativity extends in a way that is deeply personal for me. Seeing this creativity at the core of the trajectory of Afghan identity, as well as defining my experience in the diaspora, forming the way in which I can reclaim my experience from amongst the imposed erasures and silences, while challenging and shifting narratives, allowing me to claim my experience of displacement as not something that has hollowed me out, but as something that adds to my fullness, which gives me a multidimensionality of perspective and experience from which to always crystallize a sense of self, which beckons me to join dots, to make something out of a reconciliation of what dominant narratives have long split as irreconcilable, to reach deeper and beyond these constructs and to hold on to something that is more universal and more enduring. Displaced people are creative makers. We remake ourselves, and without romanticizing it, often out of necessity, drawing upon and according to the adaptability, resilience, and strength needed to respond to the crushing and historically normalized frameworks of exclusion that bear down upon us. Our longevity and our healing begins with an ability to take the strands of our ancestry, our history, our memories that otherwise risk being lost, and to weave them together with the novel and the unknown that we find ourselves in, to propagate them into something that is at once ancient and new, and in this reinvention to understand that there is very little separating loss and hope. To me, this is the essence of creativity, and far from being an abstract or peripheral experience, it is a necessary essence of ourselves that must be reclaimed for the uncertain world that we all find ourselves in. And it lies in the core of the story of all that exists, from the way we move to being echoes of one another, to allowing us to push the frontiers of what's possible. Tashakkur. Thank you.
While we're doing that, there is so much in what you say. They are such rich talks. It's a great pleasure and humbling and enriching to be in your company and the company of this room. And it's not something to tie up in a bow. We are in motion, as you said so eloquently. And we get to change things. And so rather than tie things up with questions and stick into that space, I want to try and stay with the flow of it. And I'm wondering what you would gift each other at this point, what you would, in this environment, hand to each other and hand to the room. And I'm also going to ask the room, rather than do questions back and forth, what questions will carry you throughout the rest of today? So, Zalash, simply because you had a bit of time, what is in your mind? What would you like to bring into this conversation?
I'm so floored by what Durkhanay has said. So much of what she said resonates with my experience. I keep thinking about empathy as the Ukrainian crisis carries on being on our television screens, and exactly as Durkhanay said, our selective empathy for different people is what's been on my mind for the last few weeks. And you talked about gifts. I think for us to survive what we're going through and to survive the climate catastrophe, which now has taken a back seat, we really need to expand empathy for everything. And I hope that that's a gift that we can all share in all over the world, particularly people who have power over other people.
Turkani, have you more to add?
Yeah, I won't say too much, but I think the gift of burying down instead of looking up, the gift of excavation that takes us to a space of empathy that doesn't arise from presuming we could walk in another's shoes, but arises from understanding ourselves unmasked and seeing that in that space, shedded of superficialities and externalities, that we are all reflections of each other. And that takes burying down.
You may not hear it, but there's great agreement in this room. I would like to thank you at this point. If you can stay with us for the next bit, do, but it is an addition. So firstly, from me and from this room, our thanks.
Thank you.
And so for this room, digital or real, and Tala and if you're over in the middle of the night, and Turkani and Zalash, if you're able to still stay with us. All the way through this week, there have been many things going on within this building, one of which has been fellows from the Atlantic Fellowship. These are fellowships all around the world, developing from all sorts of different programs, including the Global Brain Health Institute. And within one of those, the group that's been meeting here, has been Johnny Miller. And Johnny is part of a group which includes Turkani and Tala, called the Narratives of Displacement. And you may have seen on the top corridor a series of photographs, pictures made, images made with people in Jordan in 2019. People that were largely, in that group of photographs, living in Zatari refugee camp. And they were made in a hurry, and they were made improvised, and they were made in motion, and they were made with 20-odd people coming and hanging out in a hotel room with a bicycle lamp and a piece of fabric that Johnny ran around the city in a cab to find. And that's what made those pictures. And they're a moment in time. But we're really, really aware that nothing about us without us. That every voice that's been involved, that we are conversing with, should widen our experience, and every person should have a voice. And so, in the middle of this week, in the middle of everything else, we reached out to Rima Al-Hamad. And Rima is one of the people that you can see photographed. And when we met Rima originally, well, when Tala met Rima originally, she was in university. She was attending university while living in Zatari. She had come with her family from Syria, and now she is in the Americas. So I don't really have anything else to add to this. I'm just going to hand over to the tech people. We'll play the last video, and then at the end of this, we'll call this session to a close. I'd also like to thank
you've been working together
the
for
tech people. 5 years, just about now. How did Rima? How did it start? How did you first meet Tala?
I remember like we were in the University of Zakra, like in Jordan, and there are and Dr. Tala like entered the room and she has like really a lot of papers, and each one of us like gets. I remember they were 6 pages or something, and then they start talking about their research. It was really. I remember like all of us were listening. Like it was the first time someone talked with us about mental health. And it's kind of sad, like you go through the experience of leaving your country, you flee, you live in a camp, and no one before talked with you about mental health. Some people like in the camp or who go through this experience, they don't even get the chance to talk about their mental health. So I remember it was the first time someone asked us like how you feel. Inside yourself, how you feel. It's not like just a question how you feel like. We follow that papers, and for the first time we feel someone like care about us, care about like our mental health. And oh, Dr. Tala, she was so kind. Like even after the meeting, like I remember me, my sister and other friends, we just stay and talk with her and ask her more about her research, and she told us more about her like work. And I remember in that day, I just looked at her and I was like, oh, I want to be like her one day.
And Talat, so when you first met Rima, what were you studying? And how does that link with what you're doing now?
Right. So actually, I was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard, at the Harvard School of Public Health, when I first met Rima. I got funded to go study refugee law, which is something that I'm very passionate about. And it's something that is hard to get funding for because nobody cared back in the time really about what's happening in Syria or in Jordan or in the Middle East. For a lot of the donors and especially the scientific research donors here in the US, they just thought of the Middle East as this inflamed war zone that no research can happen in. However, Dr. Bernard Lown, who was my mentor at Harvard, he is one of the most influential people in my career.
This is Bernard Land that won the Nobel Prize for bringing together scientists against the bomb. No, you tell me more. You know, he's your mentor.
That's exactly right, Dominique. So Dr. Bernard Lown won the Nobel Peace Prize because he founded something called International Physician for the Prevention of Nuclear War during the height of the conversations between the US and Russia, when things were very close to starting a World War III between the two countries. Dr. Bernard Lown worked very closely with a Russian doctor in Russia to really produce science that is showing what could happen to humanity if nuclear war happens. And that was a paper that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the top journals for health in the world, as we know, and it got picked up by a lot of the policymakers, including the presidents of both the US and Russia at the time, and really has helped in the prevention of the nuclear war. And that's why he was given the Nobel Peace Prize. So he himself really believed in the refugee cause and believed in what's happening in the Syria right now could heighten to another catastrophe. And now we're seeing it again with Ukraine, where again, wars we're not far from having a nuclear war and a world war really. So that's why the research should be happening. That's why everyone in every field and discipline should be working on this issue and on lifting the voices of refugees. And how can we as scientists, as creative minds and brains, as artists really contribute to this issue?
I want to ask you something about memory, because one of the reasons we create photographs is to have a memory of that moment. And I wonder how you moved from your home into Zaatari and now to Canada, and what memories you've left behind and what new memories you're creating.
It will be interesting if I say it like every day before you sleep, your mind always like play with you and bring some memories. But it's interesting that all of my memories is from Syria. I feel somehow That's my mind. Ignore the 8 years I lived in Jordan. Like, even whenever I'm talking with people, I will be, oh, back in my home in Syria, back in my home in Syria. It's sad that as a person, I have to ignore 8 years from my life. Even though they had like beautiful memories between them, like at least our experience in the hotel, like that was a nice one to remember. But I know bringing this memory to my mind will bring, oh, why you go to the hotel to take picture for your experience? Oh, that's because you're in the camp. Oh, you are a refugee. Then you know, then your mind will play with you and take you back to the sadness and the same feeling of being like out of your country and living in I can't even say a room. Like caravans can't be described as a room. I think we can say like small space in this world. I don't know. I don't know if that's just me or most of the refugees don't want to remember these memories, try to ignore it. And it's sad that you have like long time in your life that affect you every day, and you fight your mind to ignore it.
Rima, you're just brilliant. Me and Johnny are smiling, and probably the audience in the room are all smiling. We wish we were with you all. But Rima, I want to touch on what's happening now in Ukraine a little bit more, since this is, in Europe that this conference is happening. A lot of the media now is covering Ukraine in a way that they didn't when it came to Syria and Afghanistan. A lot of the donors are rushing into helping, refugees, which they should. We are calling for
Yes.
more focus on refugee health and refugee issues all over the world, no matter where refugees come from, no matter what race they are, no matter what color their skin is. But how do you feel about this? And a lot of the policies, for example, in the United States here, they don't have, they have temporary protected status that is being offered right now for Ukrainian refugees. That was not the case for Syrians or Afghans more recently.
For myself, like as someone go through the war and understand like what's mean like to sleep in a shelter and what's mean like to see small kids crying and how it's feel like that you are so close from death and you wake up every day like and say, oh, I'm alive. I understand this experience, and from my deep heart I wish like no one in this world go through it. As you say, like it's like what their color, what they are from, what their background, as I believe like no one is responsible about the guilt of their government or some people from their group or whatever, like the image that was taken about them. Like even now when I'm talking about this war, I can't say Russian because I know there is million of Russians, people who they are against this war and who they feel the Ukrainian and they don't want anyone to be killed in this war. I blame the governments. I blame the leader of this war who support heath and who start these wars. I believe that these people who control the media, they are the most people responsible about this blood and this time of the war. I understand like how it's important to film like, and I understand like everything happened now and I'm to support Ukraine and I'm against the war. But it's sad for me to see how much people now they are against Putin and the Russian government. Even that 7 years ago, this government bombed my country. They killed hundreds of kids. They killed hundreds of women. They killed people who were sleeping in their house. Many families, Syrian families, were cleared. Like no one from them survived in that part of time. No one talk about it. No one even know that Russia, some people don't know that Russia actually support the regime in my country. No one know how 100,000 of people died in this war, how struggled the people. I even hear people now saying like, oh, the war's end. Why these refugees don't go back to their home? They don't know that this regime killed anyone who were against them when they arrived to the border of the country. Whenever like anyone against the regime arrive, you can't hear about them anymore. They will disappear from this war. it's sad how evil is Russia when they bombed Ukraine and how much it's fine when they bombed Syria. I can't understand this bipolar view of the world. For myself, I believe that each soul is in this earth equal the earth itself. I don't care about the power, I don't care about governments, I don't care about this world system, the money, the economy, all this stuff that all people talk about, because I believe all that can't equal one soul of the human beings. If you are not living to make this world, to care about all these souls, and your like main goal is to have all these people survive at least, you are not a leader. And sorry to say that, I think they don't deserve even the power they have.
It's been incredible to talk with you. Everyone here, and I mean this truthfully, has told me these portraits are affecting them. It's one woman told me it's like they're looking into her soul. So if there's nothing else, you've reached people in this room, and this video and your words, I know are going to reach many more. So from me and from everyone on behalf of the Creative Brain Week and Atlantic Fellows and everyone here in Dublin, thank you very, very much.
Thank you for your work. Like, you are helping millions of refugees with this in this small room. Thank you so much.
Keep shining, Rima.
Keep coming back. There will be time to bring your questions. If you want to see the complete version of that, if you go to narrativesofdisplacement.org, it'll be there as soon as we can manage in real time. Have a coffee, have a break, and thank you.